right. How many of you have been watching Loki? Okay. How many of you have watched at least an episode of Loki? One episode. We've got a thumbs down from Chris, the video guy. Thanks for your support, Chris. Who can tell me what the TVA is? This is not a spoiler. What is the TVA? Let's shout it out. The Time Variance Authority. Okay. We're good with the music there, Gwen. Thank you. All right. Time Variance Authority. TVA. Well, so in our talk this morning, we had ODE, O-D-E. Anyone remember what that was? What O stood for? Origin. D is design. E is ethics. Good. Now we have the TVA. The TVA. Transmission, verisimilitude, and accounts of eyewitnesses. TVA. So you have ODE and TVA. I'm trying to come up with fun acronyms. How am I doing? Okay, thank you. Yeah, TVA. So when we think about the reliability of the Bible, there's a number of questions that we first need to ask. Now, in tonight's talk, I don't have enough time to get into issues about the Old Testament. While it's extremely valuable, the Christian faith hinges upon the reliability of the New Testament. So I'll be focusing a lot of my attention on the New Testament. So in terms of preliminary questions, transmission is the first question we ask, because transmission deals with the text that we have today. Is it the same text that they wrote back then? If it's a different text, like the Muslim believes, right? The Muslim thinks that the text has become corrupted. God, according to the Muslim, God gave the prophet Jesus the Injil, what we call the gospel. But they think it's been corrupted. So it's an empirical claim that's made upon the Christian faith. Here's what David Cross says. He's a comedian. Perhaps you've heard this. Back when the Bible was written, then edited, then rewritten, then rewritten, then re-edited, then translated from dead languages, then retranslated, then edited, then rewritten, then given to kings for them to take their favorite parts, then rewritten, then translated again, then given to the Pope for him to approve, then rewritten, then edited again, then rewritten again, all based on stories that were told orally 30 to 90 years after they happened to people who didn't know how to write. So maybe that's just what Christianity is based off of, right? Well, David Cross is a comedian, and as I like to tell people, if you're getting your theology from a comedian, don't be surprised if it's a joke. Thanks, Cap. All right, so this statement here is extremely ignorant of the process of where we receive our English editions of the Bible. There is a New Testament scholar, someone who really studies the text, studies history, knows it very well. His name is Bart Ehrman. Have any of you heard of that name before, Bart Ehrman? So he teaches at the University of North Carolina. He's not a Christian. And so here's what he says. It's certainly a bit more sophisticated, but we're going to look at some of the claims he makes tonight. He says, not only do we not have the originals, that is the originals of, say, the New Testament, right? The manuscripts. We don't even have copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. What we have are copies made later, much later. In most instances, they are copies made many centuries later. And these copies all differ from one another in many thousands of places. As we will see later in this book, these copies differ from one another in so many places that we don't even know how many differences there are. Possibly it's easiest to put it in comparative terms. There are more differences among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Boy, that really doesn't help you feel secure about what we have, do we? Well, what we have, in some cases, is a tale of two Barts. There are times where Dr. Ehrman will cast skeptical doubt on what we have or what we don't have. And there are other times where he nuances and clarifies it. So one statement could really make you feel scared and fearful about the text and that it hasn't been passed along faithfully. But then, in that very same book, perhaps that very same page, he'll all of a sudden ease your concern. Because here's the reality about some of those differences that he's talked about. The reality is, he says, this is him again, quote, most of these differences are completely immaterial and insignificant. These are small, minor details, extremely small, a grammatical mishap that may have been corrected, for example. So, all of a sudden, it's not as big of a deal. But elsewhere in a series of lectures, he casts doubt yet again. He says, so we do have some copies that we can compare. He says it's difficult to know what the authors of the Greek New Testament wrote, because all of these surviving copies differ from one another, sometimes significantly. So he says it's difficult. I think if I were to sort of give a charitable read here, what he means to say is that in some of the extremely minor cases, it's difficult to know. But in terms of the general cases, these differences are very insignificant and should not be concerning at all. So, in fact, he has concluded in a textbook which is used in many universities, secular universities, for those that want to study the New Testament. Here's his conclusion. In spite of these remarkable differences, scholars are convinced that we can reconstruct the original words of the New Testament with reasonable, though probably not 100% accuracy. Some scholars have put that number at 98, 99% accuracy. So we can be extremely certain as to the scope of the words that have not been changed. But I do want to run through an exercise here. I'm going to perform a magic trick, if you will. David Montoya was our professional magician. He didn't get a chance to illustrate some tricks. But I want to see if I can do a little bit of magic here. So I'm wondering if you guys can get out your Bibles. I'm going to make some verses disappear from your Bibles. Okay, and I want to start here. Let's see if this will... Okay, could I get someone, raise one volunteer. I'd like one volunteer. Yes, right here. Could you come on stage, please? Thank you, thank you. Okay, could you look up Matthew 17:21? And another volunteer? Is there another volunteer? In back, yes? Okay, you'll have Luke 17:36. And a final volunteer. Yeah, hand there. Okay, 1 John 5:7-8. We can play a little bit of music. And maybe the Loki music. That was kind of fun. So Matthew 17:21, Luke 17:36, and 1 John 5:7-8. Let's see here. What version? Let's see here.
I have NIV.
17:20.
So it's right there. It says E.
Huh? Oh, so there's no verse there.
Yeah, there's no verse there.
Oh, what's that? There's no verse? Okay, what do we have here? We've got Luke 17:36. Oh, no. Luke, okay, could you read it out loud, please? Luke 17:36. Could you read it out loud, please?
There's nothing there.
What? Ooh.
No kidding.
Okay, 1 John 5:7-8. Yep, okay, go ahead. Oh, let's see, what edition? She has a special Bible. Oh, yes, she does. Who has an NIV?
I do.
Someone else? You? NLT? You
It's not supposed to be.
Ooh, some verses. Oh, that trick wasn't as good. Who's got an NIV? You there. 1 John 5:7-8. But stay up here if you could, please. Could you step back here? Thank you. Yes, come on up. Come on up. I saw a hand. Yep. Yep.
Mine doesn't say anything. Are you going to make them reappear?
We have some missing verses. 1 John. Let's see here. Oh, that's John. We need to go to 1 John. Okay, here's 1 John 5:7, verse 7.
6, 7 here, right there.
Oh, okay. What?
I got
Did you see?
NIV.
Oh, NIV, okay. I'll have to look this up in the... Okay, so there's some explanation going on here. Okay. How many of you are a little confused? How many of you have Bible verses there in your text? Let's take one at a time. Matthew, who's got Matthew 17:21? Okay. Do you have an NKJV or a KJV? Yes? What do you have? What edition? New American Standard Bible. NASB. It's in brackets. Okay, good. Thank you for that qualification. An E, okay.
I have a C.
Okay, all right.
Just a tiny C.
So what explains these differences? Why do some Bibles have some of these verses but others don't? What explains this? Okay, go ahead and sit down. Thank you. All right, so you have all seen a little bit of magic here tonight of disappearing verses and reappearing. Yes. Some editions have the verse and others do not. Why? So this is what Dr. Ehrman is talking about with some of these differences. Okay? So the explanation for these magically disappearing verses is that some English translations are based off of certain manuscript families. There are certain manuscripts that were discovered in certain geographical regions, and some date very early or earlier in time than others. So there's what's called the Byzantine family of manuscripts, and that's the manuscript family that the King James and the New King James Version is based off of. There's what's called the Alexandrian family of texts. So those are the oldest manuscripts we have. And those manuscripts lead to the NIV or an ESV edition of the Bible. So that's why some of these manuscripts don't have those verses. So scholars have reasoned that these were later editions by a copyist who may have added it. It could have been a side note. Sometimes you perhaps might make notes in your Bible, right, when you're doing a devotional. Well, what would happen, since there was no printing press back then, is that the next monk would come along and think that that was supposed to go in. So they put it in. And that's how sometimes these mistakes happen. So what happens if you have in the manuscript family a mistake, and that mistake gets copied, and then copied and copied? Then that error lives on. So when Dr. Ehrman's talking about these many differences, sometimes one little mistake could count many, many, many times in the manuscript database, if you will. All right? So it's nothing that in particular should be too fearful. In fact, the host of Christian doctrine, not a single core Christian creed, loses its value because of any of these differences in the manuscript text. All right? So that's how confident we can be that the text we have today is what was written back then. And I want to share a little bit of the data with you on some of these manuscripts that I've been talking about. Okay, so there are three major manuscripts: Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Alexandrinus. So these date to the 4th and 5th centuries. Codex Sinaiticus, which has now been exhaustively digitized. You can go read a Greek manuscript online in its entirety if you want. Contains a complete copy of the New Testament. And it resides in the British Library. If any of you ever get a chance to go to London, you can actually go see it yourself. Codex Vaticanus resides in the Vatican, and Alexandrinus resides in the British Library. There are about 4,000 to maybe 5,000 known manuscripts of the Bible, or parts of the Bible, made between the 2nd century and the 15th century. In particular, there are 3 codices. These 3 codices are seen as the greatest treasures of Christian antiquity that we have. So, if I can move on to P52, this is the earliest manuscript that we have discovered of the New Testament. And what makes this really special is that it comes from John. Back in the 19th century, scholars believe that John, because it has a high Christology, a robust sense of Jesus' divinity, believe that this couldn't have been written in the first century. No. This is 2nd or 3rd century, the book of John, the Gospel of John. But we discovered this manuscript, now called P52. If you visit the University of Manchester in Manchester, England, you can see it yourself. It's caged in glass and carbonite so no one can take it out. It preserves John 18, 31 to 33, and on the backside, 37 to 38. And it's dated to the 2nd century, the first half of the 2nd century. The best guess is 120 AD. It's the earliest manuscript that we have. And scholars date this through looking at the handwriting style, running tests on the papyri, the parchment that it was printed on. What makes this really fun, though, is because of this discovery, scholars, liberal scholars, had to shift the date at which they thought John was written. Okay? So what makes this really neat is P52 could be a simple copy of the original of John's Gospel, because it dates that early. That could be, it's unlikely that that is a fragment of the original, but it could be a copy. So we're not talking copies of copies or copies of copies of copies, but it could just be 1 degree separation. So that's P52. And there are thousands of these papyri, these P numbers that you can go and research and read about, and you can sort of begin to patchwork the New Testament to see how soon do we have complete copies. So it's really neat. There's a few more I want to talk about. The Bodmer Papyri, 22 papyri discovered in 1952. By the way, the 20th century was the best century in terms of archaeology for Christian apologetics, because we discovered more things that confirmed what the New Testament talks about than ever before in Christian history. The Bodmer Papyri, that you have 22 papyri, they come around 200 AD, these are dating. The Chester Beatty Papyri, which is in Dublin, 11 papyri announced in 1931, date to the 2nd and 3rd century. Here's why this is really cool. These together are enough to compile all of Luke, John, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Hebrews, and portions of Matthew, Mark, Acts, and Revelation. So you almost get the entire New Testament from these two discoveries, which those do date earlier than the 3 major manuscripts that I mentioned. So the Bodmer Papyri is P46 and P75, if anyone's taking notes. And Chester Beatty Papyrus, P45, P46, P47. So those are technical references. Okay, so why is it that the early dates are important? For a number of reasons. One, the earlier the text, the better, generally speaking. But here's another reason. When we consider the dating of the New Testament, no, not that kind of dating, young men and young women, the dating here refers to the years that these texts were written and what our best guesses are about the original. So you can look at that chart and you can make certain observations. When we look at other documents from ancient history, we can see a large time gap between the original and the manuscript. And look at the Greek New Testament all the way at the bottom. So compare, let's say, for example, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Okay, so the date of the original, 5th century BC. Earliest manuscript is 3rd century BC, so we got about a 200-year gap. Okay, that's pretty good. Manuscript copies about 185. All right, let's take the Gallic Wars of Julius Caesar. The date of the original, we think, was written sometime between 58 and 44 BC. Okay, but, earliest manuscript, 9th century AD. That's a difference of 900 years between when the text was written by someone and when we have that manuscript. That's a lot of time. Okay. All right, well, let's look at the Greek New Testament now. So what we have is a range of when it was written, roughly 45 to no later than 100 AD. Okay, that's when the originals were written. And the manuscript evidence, therefore, the earliest we can find, the better. It pushes us closer and closer. So that gap between when it was written and our earliest manuscript shrinks and shrinks. And when you compare it to other documents of history, the New Testament is on really good ground. Really good ground. And then when you look at the manuscript copies, we're on the best ground ever. The Bible is the most copied manuscript in history. That's how important this text was to Western civilization. Okay, so that's all cool beans. Here's the bottom line on the transmission of the text. So, while there are textual variants, haha, Loki pun, variants, and differences, right? So you get the concept of a variant now. Even in a manuscript, there's a difference. It's inaccurate to suggest that they should cast a reasonable doubt on the New Testament tradition. The sheer vastness of our textual resources buries that argument, unless, of course, we're willing to cast much heavier doubt on other manuscripts from ancient history. So, is it difficult to know what the New Testament authors, what the Gospel authors really wrote, as one of the Dr. Ehrman says? Well, not really. It's not really that hard. We can have reliable certainty about what the New Testament text says.